So hopefully you can see the API4 spec that I've got up on the wiki page here, and just want to go through some of the things that we've talked about on the API listserv, looking at taking something that is taking all the goodness of API 3, getting rid of some of the badness, and implementing some of the things that we've felt like we've been blocked with all the backward compatible layers that are in API 3. There's not as much room for growth. And so taking a look at doing it as well as we can with the resources that we have, making sure that it's well tested, that it's clean, consistent, that we don't build in a lot of extra stuff that we ain't going to need, and take advantage of some of PHP's language features, and I'll tell you more about that, discoverability, and most of all, doable, something that we can actually get out the door. There isn't a deadline or a timeline set for the API4. It's something that, you know, just a few people have said, let's get started on this and see where it goes. And so hopefully more people are going to join us. And let's take a look at, let's start by taking a look at the API 3. Do feel free to type in any questions that you have, and I will try to address them. So this is a typical API 3 PHP file. This is for the line item. It could be anything. And I just want to note what it looks like. Here at the bottom, you'll see line item get, line item delete. These functions basically do nothing except hand it off to the generic functions, basic get, basic delete. There's also a create function that also hands it off to the basic create function, and it also does this one extra funny thing. And then there's a spec function that adds extra information about the parameters and or fields. And so that's basically what an API 3 file is going to look like. It just hands stuff off to the basic creates and maybe does some funny stuff. And so thinking about how we can do that in a possibly more elegant way, I want to show you what we've got for a API 4 file. So this is the API 4 participant, and it basically contains nothing. And the reason that it doesn't need to contain anything is because it uses class inheritance. So the API 3 files are not classes. They don't inherit anything, and so they have to do everything themselves. And the API team sort of minimized the amount of boilerplate needed by writing these generic functions that they can immediately hand off to. And so in the same way, the participant class is essentially it's inheriting the base entity class, which is just a factory. So in calling the API 4, you just want to have some factory class you can call that'll return you the object that you can then work with. And so to give you an example of that, let's look at the test. So here's the participant test. And if I can just get to an upsane part of it. So here, take a look at this part here. So this calls the factory that we just looked at. And this calls a static method in the factory, or a factory function that returns the actual object that we can then work with. And this object has properties. It can do things. It can set, say we only want 5 results. Say we want to set, say we want to only select participants with a contact ID of anything. We can do that with the object that's being returned. So let's go back and look at the entity base class. Here it is. Sorry, not that one, this one. So again, this is it's a bunch of factory functions, and you can see that it only does one thing, which is it takes whatever function you were trying to get and it hands you an object. And so that's all done with this magic method that just looks to see if that class exists and instantiates it if it does. And this is sort of comparable if you know anything about the API 3 guts. it's sort of comparable to all of the acrobatics that the API 3 does to look everywhere that that file could possibly exist. When you call, API 3 contact create, it's going to look everywhere that that file might exist, in extensions, wherever, in the generic folders. And this is just a little bit simpler than that because we're just letting PHP do that for us. We're already using autoloaders. PHP already knows where to find these classes. All we need to do is call them. And so then we don't even need to create these methods to return the objects. We can just annotate them. And so these are the basic annotations that we sort of expect every entity to be implementing. Every entity should have a get fields, get actions, create, update, and delete functions. If it has others, then it can annotate those, or if it overrides others, then it can annotate those as well. So in our API4 participant file, this class does nothing. It just inherits the base class, and it has one extra annotation to say that actually we're doing one thing different here. We've got our own get method. We're overriding the generic get method, and we're actually using participant get, which is right here. And the only reason that we're overriding participant get is because we want to set a default here. We might do more things, but this is just an example of something that we can do. We're setting a default to say that the where has a default value of not test. So by default, we're not going to return test participants. And because notice that this is a protected variable. So again, just taking advantage of what PHP, you can argue about whether or not PHP is actually an elegant language or not, but you can tell, you can at least, we can take advantage of what's there. And so PHP allows us to set protected variables. And so instead of having the person who's actually using the API clobber this whenever they set something in the where clause, our API4 is going to take care of merging in these defaults for us. And the other thing that you'll notice is that there's these annotations and doc blocks over everything. And so if you look at the basic action, this is the action-based class, and it has everything that you can set about the API, including passing in extra API calls to chain, or setting check permissions, true or false, deciding what the entity is. These are things that are annotated class variables, and we're taking a look at, Tim and I are taking a look at actually using more annotations so that if you have an entity that takes an extra parameter, and that parameter is required, you can mark it required, and the API will actually read that annotation and enforce it. So that is something that we haven't implemented yet, but I think that would be pretty cool. The other nice thing is that these doc blocks and these annotations are going to come through in get fields. And so when you request data about the metadata about the API, it's going to read its own code and report all of this stuff to you, including these inherit doc tags will be transformed into the actual documentation from the parent class that'll come through in get fields as well. Now there's a run function that you may have noticed as I was zipping through all of this stuff in the action-based class, and that function, it's down here somewhere. This is a little bit more complicated than it needs to be, mostly because of backward compatibility. But you can ignore all of this code. It's tested and it worked, and it allows the API kernel to operate both with version 3 and version 4 of the API. And so every API action is going to need to declare a run function. And so, for example, the get action declares this run function. And this is essentially what is actually going to do the work. And so our generic API for get function does this. It creates a select query, passes through all the parameters that you've set, runs it, and stores that in the result. So let's take a look at this result object, because this is pretty cool. The API for result is an iterable object. And so you know that in API 3, when you're returned some results, you will have an array, and that array will look something like, well, like this. Result, and also version. Also, it sets a few other things, count, whatever. And so in order to access the results of an API 3 call, you need to access result. Now, with API 4, this iterable object is kind of nice because you can simply access it directly. Looking at this on the wiki, here it is. This little example here. To break this example down, so this is our factory function that returns an object that has, among other things, an execute method. And the execute method will give you this result object. And then you can just loop through it. Every result in this for each loop is one of the contacts that you're getting. Or you can also call a few handy methods, like let me just grab the first one, or let me re-index these results, because the sequential option in API v3 is one of those like weird things where it's an input, but it's really about output. And so here, if you want to make the output sequential, it will be by default. Or if you want to index it by ID, so that you have an associative array of contact ID to contact, you just tell it that that's what you want, and then the results will re-index themselves. So that's kind of fun. Let's take a look at the tests. So the goal here is to have everything tested and to not build anything in API 4 that isn't tested. So this participant object, everything that it does so far, I think, has a test written for it. Here's a test that doesn't exist yet, but just to show you some of what can happen. So participant create, let's say. Now this is a non-functional function so far, but at least the way that we're using the language, it thinks that it can do something. So let me show you what it thinks it can do. So we've been returned from this create factory an object, which is the API create action. And you can set check permissions to be true or false. In PHP, again, it defaults to false. So we could override that and set it to true. You can do all of these things, and this is kind of fun because we're taking advantage of the PHP language to make the API more discoverable. This is the experience that a developer would have now if they're in PHP of using the API, is that everything that it can do is going to pop up in their IDE. So if you were to set a value, like I want to create a participant with a contact ID of 5, I could set another value with a test 1. Or I could, if I'm getting impatient with that, I could set a whole bunch of values. And pass a whole array of, associative array, like contact ID. Etc. And then I can execute it. And there's my API call. Now the equivalent to that, because maybe you're going to ask, well, what about the old method of doing these things? This should look very familiar. So this will also work. It'll do the exact same thing. So these two, it just depends on your taste. You can do it this way. You can do it this way. This is also tested and works, both methods for calling the API. And the big reason for the second way is that it allows us to more easily support bindings like JavaScript, where you can't use a PHP object in JavaScript. And so we have this way of serializing stuff behind the scenes. This function is going to do this. Actually, I think that maybe some sharp person would have noticed that because of the outer. So it's not exactly like API 3. We've got a more strict way of sorting the difference between, we actually are paying attention to the difference between values and parameters in API 4. So like something like check permissions belongs in the outer layer, whereas the values does not. Hopefully that makes sense. But what this is going to do behind the scenes is it's going to take this serialized array that we've just passed in, all of this, and it's going to pass it to the participant create object and execute it. So the exact same thing is going to happen. Okay. Hopefully that's enough of me talking. I'm going to go back to the Hangout. Stop sharing my screen because that's a little bit silly. Okay, now it looks like some people have asked questions, so I appreciate that. Joe, you've asked some great questions, and I actually did invite you to be on this call, so you're welcome to add your voice to this conversation too. Let me just take some of these questions that have been asked. So one of the questions was, what about testing for error or seeing error messages? And so this hasn't been fleshed out entirely in API 4, but my thought so far has been, let's take the PHP language as far as it can get. And so let's take the fact that you can just throw an exception from anywhere in the PHP stack and then catch it somewhere else. And so if the API is calling the BAO and the BAO throws an exception, that can bubble up, and we can either catch it and make it nicer in the API layer, or we can just not and make it the caller's responsible to know that if an exception is called, which is what we're sort of going towards anyway, is having the API throw exceptions, then it would be up to you to catch that or to do something about it. Hopefully that answers your question. There aren't any other questions that I see asked. If this was Stack Exchange, I would be downvoting the questions as not questions. Hello, in response to the hello questions. I do apologize about the blurry visuals. Hopefully it made some sense with me talking about it. I don't know if people are using the chat feature or if I can even find the chat feature. But that's my quick introduction. I was hoping to lead a discussion now, but it seems like the webinar format doesn't lend itself very well to that. Oh, some people are on IRC. That's helpful. Okay, I'm going to take a few more questions now. I'm seeing some people on the IRC chat. Okay, great. So Mark asks, if you pass invalid values for multiple fields, will the API report back the error for each field, or only the first one where an exception is thrown? That is a great question, Mark. I'm not sure if we're there yet in terms of figuring out everything about the API for. I think it's important. Yes, John, I'm seeing the IRC messages. Oh, I think we have Tim joining us.
Yeah, I connected one way and found another way to connect. That does apparently let me do audio. So there's also on Google Hangouts, I wanted to tell you, a feature called Questions, which you can get to through this 9 square block in the corner. And there are a few more questions in there from Noah and Mark and Xavier.
Yeah, I was just taking a look at those and also trying to keep up with the thread of IRC as well.
Okay.
If you know the answers to any of these, Tim, please jump in while I'm reading some of them.
Let's see.
Okay, let me take a look at these other questions. So Noah's asked, you mentioned that API 3 has gathered some cruft and API 4 would be starting fresh. Can you elaborate? Sure, I can. So API 3 is great, and I've been developing on it a lot and trying to push it a little bit. So for example, I don't know if anybody's noticed this, but it's kind of a cool feature in CiviCRM 4.7, the latest release that a lot of people have not upgraded to yet. But when you do, this is going to be fun. The API Explorer will actually show you that you can do more now with the API GET function. You can actually join onto other entities, and it'll show you those. And so that was kind of a bear to develop in the API 3 because it meant working around all the existing stuff and the syntax, and it felt like that was about as far as I could push it. And so I'm excited to be able to take API 4 and start off at a place, we can't predict the future. We don't know everything we're gonna want to build into this thing. But it's nice to be able to start off with saying, yeah, these are all the features. This is where API 3 has developed, and a lot of the ways that it's developed have been despite the way that it was initially designed, because the people who were initially designing it didn't think of everything. Of course, it's very hard to think of everything. And so API 3 has sort of grown organically. There's like 3 different ways to pass in certain parameters. It accepts different spellings of different entities, working around a lot of backwards compatibility stuff. Some names of parameters have changed over the years, and so there's like layers of backward compatibility for accepting different names for things. So it's nice to just be able to leave all that behind with API 4. That's not the only reason for starting API 4, but that's appealing to me. One of my big complaints about API 3 is that get fields, it's cluttered with things that are not fields, and so I'm excited to be able to separate some of that out. Separating fields from parameters is kind of awesome and exciting. next question.
There was one that Xavier asked about any plans to change the REST interface along with this. Maybe I should hop on that for a second.
Sure.
Okay, so this is actually an interesting question that's come up in a couple other formats. And my take is that in discussing the API, there are a couple things which are nearly orthogonal, which are the calling interface in PHP, and then the implementation on the back end and the data model. So what we've seen in this demo is actually showing some differences across all of those. But I think the big motivation was in having some freedom to change the data model, which requires a version increment, and in having a more class-oriented structure as opposed to the procedural functions in the structure. And when we start talking about interfaces, whether we're talking about REST or there's a variation on REST called JSON API, which tries to standardize it a bit more. And then there's the Smarty interfaces, there's Drush, there are Ajax bindings, and so on. When we talk about those things, all that really matters is that we have a single clear entry point with a single clear calling notation. So that function CiviCRM underscore API has been really useful for building all those bindings, and that we have good metadata coming out of it. And I think that maybe API 4 will provide better metadata than API 3. But API 3 does provide a fair amount of metadata already. And I feel like you can actually improve the REST interface in a way which is orthogonal to all of the data model stuff and the class reorganization stuff.
Great. John asked, what's next for the API 4? And no, I haven't covered that already, and I'm glad you asked, because I think one of the big what's next is to get more people involved in it. That's why I wanted to show this off and show some of the things that we're doing with it and say, this is just a start, and it's great to have. I did most of this coding at the Sprint in Colorado, and it feels like it's great because it's real now and it's better than nothing, but it's still not functional, and it still needs a lot of work adding tests and entities, answering some head scratching questions like what to do. Like my most recent question is like what to do about the all the weirdness in the BAO create functions. Like how do we contain that mess or have it not like have that mess? What's the least messy way to implement create and update in API 4? So I've just been like posing some of those questions and playing with things, and there is not a timeline right now. There's no. It's nice that we have the space that API 3 is mature and it works and people know how to use it, and so it's not like this big pressure of, God, the API is awful and we need to fix it right now and let's slap something together. I don't want to drag my feet on this either. But it is nice that we don't have to rush it. And the more people that get involved, the quicker the progress we'll make. Mark asked another question about data validation, and it's a tricky subject because it depends on what kind of validation you want. If I can go back to sharing my screen for a second, I'm going to, let's see, I'm going to just share this. So going back to looking at the way that these, I think this is the one that I want. So going back to looking, there's some really crude data validation. Like for example, this parameter, hopefully it's not too blurry to see, this parameter chain, which is an array, is declared in the metadata as an array. So if you pass something else, the API can say, nope, can't do that. Same with this one. It would need to say, well, it needs to be one of those, and if you pass in something really weird like an object, then we're going to reject it. So that really crude validation is really easy, and it's nice that it can be driven by annotations, because I like annotations. It's nice to have these funny symbols that you put in top of your variables and functions actually do something as well as mean something, and not have to enforce them somewhere else as well. But then there's like the database level validation. Like if you pass a contact ID for a field and that contact doesn't exist, or you don't have permission to access it, like it's very hard to validate that up front without taking a pretty big performance hit for doing so. Like you would have to, if you pass in 15 params to a create function and you want to validate each one of those params and hit the database with a select query to ensure that that param is valid in the database. So the API 3 doesn't do that. I don't think API 4 is going to do that either. API 3 tries to strike a balance, and it seems like this is a decent enough model that we could follow it, of if it hits an error and an exception is thrown, then it'll go back and look at your params and say, okay, what went wrong, and try to give you some more information about it. So doing the harder stuff after the fact, and trying to just execute the call first. Hopefully that answers your question. But again, this stuff has not been built yet for API 4, so we do have some freedom in figuring it out. And I also want to, which was about let's see, he was asking about sorry, people are talking in IRC and I'm reading that as well. Yes, agree. There needs to be in the IRC, Arcana is saying about how to have an errors array and passing in as much information as you can. And Xavier made a point that that earlier, not even in here, but that there needs to be, it would be great to have machine readable error codes in the exceptions. And there was some effort made to do that in API 3, but the effort was not enough to influence the whole system. And so there's some error codes being passed back and some not. And so if we decide, or if we just let Xavier decide what the standard should be, we can start following it with API 4 and be a little bit more strict about that. And I appreciate that people are wanting to jump in and help. That's awesome. There's so many places to jump in and help, and there's so many different things. And I'm hoping to get the core patches merged soon. There's just one little really funky test that's not passing due to those core patches. API 4 tests, or look at the API 4 code, you need to download the extension and also check out the pull request that's linked that gives the API patches. Again, I'm hoping to merge those soon, and then all you'll need is the extension. And then you can add another entity, add another test, see how it goes. You may come up against things that have you scratching your head, and let's just keep this discussion as lively as we can, because I remember when the call was put out to developers to come and help with the API 3 a few years ago, when it was mostly Xavier and Eric and Eileen developing it. They put out a blog post that had a step-by-step how to write an API 3 step-by-step, like, let's get some more hands on deck with this. And it did feel hard to jump in, because even though there was a blog post that outlined how to do it, it felt like the specs kept changing, and if I tried to follow the steps, it's like, oh no, actually we've changed that now and it's something else. So so I think if we post questions and ideas to the API listserv, and about that listserv, there has been some effort made recently. The API listserv has become really big. There's a lot of subscribers, and so now there's a more general dev listserv. And so if for people who are not specifically interested in all these fun questions about how to structure the API for, you might want to not pay so much attention to the API listserv. And I do want to not feel like I'm spamming people on there, but to keep this conversation going, and let the more general dev questions happen on the dev serve. Are there other questions that I've missed? John asked if there's any difference in performance to be expected. I'm not sure that there is. I doubt it's going to make a big difference. Hopefully API 4 won't be slower. It does have a little bit fewer layers of crufty reindex this array to match this legacy format stuff going on in it. So that might shave off a few milliseconds. Xavier also asked if it can work with 4.6 LTS. Probably not. I mean, I guess the sky's the limit, really, but it does depend on quite a few core patches that I don't think would just merge cleanly and easily into 4.6. In fact, they definitely would not. Definitely not. So yeah, I don't think that would be easy to backport. There was a lot of developments on the API 3 between 4.6 and 4.7, and so these patches to core for API 4 would not apply.
And so Coleman, you're saying that there's the pull request, but then before that pull request, there were other things that were changed, like
right,
refactoring the way basic get works, and so those things would also have to be backported or copied in some format. Basic
get has been, almost completely rewritten from 4.6 to 4.7. So any patches against it, and there are quite a few for this extension to work. There's quite a few patches against it. Just would not merge into 4.6. I'm not saying that it can't be done. I'm just saying that it would not be easy. So John just asked if there's a page with to-dos. I think that's a good idea. Let me put that on my to-do list. Make to-dos. John, thanks. Let's see, how do we mark questions as answered? Oh, that's how we do it. Wow, thanks, Google+. All right. So will there be weekly, monthly updates on progress or status? Yeah, I think that's a great idea. It might be a little bit more sporadic or random than that. As people make progress, I think it would be great to report on that progress to the API listserv. Even if you just want to say, I just implemented the line item API for version 4 and wrote a test for it, just send a quick email to the listserv, and I think that would help a lot to keep everybody up to date. And of course, if you change something in the architecture, hopefully there's going to be discussions of those changes. And another way to keep abreast of things would be to follow the API 4 Git repository so that you're seeing things that are happening. You're supposed to click on that when you're answering a question, so that you're seeing, then you can see the pull requests coming in, you can see the conversations happening, and keep abreast. It's really hard, and I'm not saying I'm not going to try, but it is really hard to keep all the documentation up to date when the architecture is constantly shifting. And so I'm not saying that to discourage anyone, far from it, but just to say, like, communication is important. So to answer this question about fields and default fields, so that's a really good question, and I'm glad you asked, because the API v3 has some really random defaults, like the contact. I mean, just try doing a contact get with no parameters passed in. It'll return you everything about contacts, including, their phone number and all these, their IM and all of these wacky things that are not actually part of the contact object. And so as it's written now, and I'm probably going to get some people disagreeing with me on this, but as it's written now, API 4 will always return, if you don't ask it to select specific fields in the object and you don't ask it to join on other objects, which you can do, then it's going to return basically a select star for that base table. So if you query the participant object with API 4, it's going to return all fields that actually belong to the participant and nothing else. So the API 3, and this is again from the days when API 3 wasn't as good, and so only recently did it add the ability for you to actually ask it to do joins. And so in the past, the contact API would just try to return everything because it didn't have, if somebody needed something, then they would add it in, and now it does all of that. And so, I've also heard people make the suggestion, well, it should return nothing by default. It should do select, and it should just return the ID. I'm not sure that that's the most developer-friendly default, and I'm not sure that select star is really that much of a performance drain. It seems like a sensible default to me, a decent compromise, because if you're selecting just the ID by default, then you'd have to, and you actually want all of the fields, then you would have to specify them all, which would be kind of a pain. So that's the default that it's got set right now. So can I speak to some of the non-traditional API entities? Not really. I think that that's a big question right now. Now, the framework that I just showed you is basically just about how we arrange the PHP classes, and there's certainly nothing to stop you from putting anything you want into these functions. So in that sense, it's not really a big change from API 3. You can create really simple CRUD-based APIs in version 3, and you can create really complex logic-driven APIs in version 3. And I don't think that there's anything in the API 4 framework to stop you from doing either one of those things. Now, it does lay out some assumptions in the class inheritance that most APIs will be CRUD APIs, and that they'll do essentially what basic get and basic create and basic delete do. And I think the reason that assumption is there is because I assumed it. And also, if you go and look at the API version 3, that's true. Most APIs are CRUD APIs. So it seems like the most convenient way to develop API 4 is to have that be built into the base class. So that those basic CRUD functions are baked into the base class. And if you want to create a basic CRUD API in version 4, you basically have to do nothing. You create one file that is the class, the factory class for that entity, and it can contain 0 lines of code, and it simply inherits everything from those basic CRUD functions. And if you want to implement more logic, if you want to create a really complex API, you just put that code in there. Now that takes another question, like what is the where does this code belong? Does the logic belong in the BAO? Does the logic belong in the API itself? I'm not sure yet. I'm on the fence about that. I wish Eileen was here to chime in on that. But it seems like, the BAOs traditionally, in API 3, there's been a big push to get logic out of the API, out of the forms, and into the BAOs. And that's good, mostly. except that the BAOs themselves are old and crufty these days. And so maybe we want to revisit that question. Okay, I have answered a lot of these questions. I'm going to just mark them as answered. So take questions here not on the IRC. Agreed. Passing invalid values for multiple fields. I don't know the specifics of that answer. I would be really excited to talk to you more about it. Xavier, your question, yes. In V3, get call on entities doesn't return all the custom field values for multi-value groups, and you should use the custom values entity to get them any custom field values at all in the entity get call. That's a great question, Mark, and I will say one thing about that. The multi-record custom fields are yet another animal, and Tim has suggested, and I'll let him speak more to that, of having them actually be their own entities in the API 4, so that if you have a multi-record custom field set, that the API 4 will just sort of automatically create a basic CRUD API for that field set. But as for directly related single value custom field sets, they are, so by default, the API 3 is weird. It depends on the entity. Sometimes it will automatically return custom fields by default. Sometimes it won't. And on API 4, people can disagree with me, but I've settled on not by default, so that again, it's select star on the base table of that entity and nothing else, no joins, because joins are expensive and you might not need them. But there's a syntax for asking for whatever custom fields you want, and it can perform those joins for you. So that's the way that it's written right now. The API 4 get is the only action that's actually working right now. Create, update, and delete are conceptually there, but are sort of hung up on the question of how much do we litter it with cruft from the BAOs and how much do we depart from that. But the get function is working and tested, and so you can see it in action if you download this extension and you try the new participant get API. You'll see that you can join on custom fields, you can join on other entities like the contact table, etc. Tim, did I do an okay job of explaining your idea about multi-custom fields? I'll take that as a yes. I'm not seeing any other questions at this point. I'm seeing Mark Hanna say that the custom field issue is big for the CiviCRM entity development. So yeah, let's work together on that and make sure that it works for what you need. All right, if there's no more questions, I think I'm going to wrap this up now and put out a quick email to the listserv, pointing them to this broadcast and saying, let's keep in touch about this. I'm happy to welcome anybody that wants to join in writing any code at all for this. There's lots of little chunks to bite off, and the more people that sort of understand what's going on, the better. So thanks everyone for being a part of this.